Bingo.
All right, good deal. I'm getting smarter every time.
Practice, practice.
All right, there. Okay, now how do I make it go to the, how do I make it do the full screen?
Just, hey, Archbishop, just to let you know, since we posted the very first video, the last time I was on there, I can't remember if it was 22 or 26, but we've had that many viewings of it, and that is more people than we have in the class. And then the other ones have gotten there too, so you're getting people from YouTube outside. We don't know how long they watched it for, but there's some people watching it online outside this class.
There's some gluttons for punishment out there.
So, but that's good news. Now, I wish I had Father Shibley's following every week, because he's got 100 and some people that tune in like weekly for him on his lecture series. And the ones, his pods, he's got thousands now. We got to learn his marketing techniques. All right, go on. All right, well, we're 6:30, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And just remind everybody, please send me an email to let me know you were in the class. I can get you registered. The last episode was already loaded on the website. I sent out the link. Hopefully I'll get a little faster on this one. Got another slam busy schedule for this weekend and everything as well, so bear with me a little bit. Archbishop, it's all you, buddy.
Right. I have to admit that the period between John Wycliffe and the end of the Wars of the Roses is not exactly my favourite period, just simply because there isn't much interesting happening intellectually or theologically. The background of this period is essentially one of instability. And there were basically two faults that a medieval king could have. One was having too few sons, and the other was having too many. And the difficulty which England faced for most of the 15th century was the fact that Edward III had had too many sons. And so there was set up a dynastic conflict between the descendants of the Duke of York and the descendants of the Duke of Lancaster, which is usually referred to as the Wars of the Roses. It's also the period to which, if you're looking for a continuous sequence of documented consecrations, it's also the period in which the line that goes back from the Anglican Church today expires, because Cardinal Beaufort was consecrated in 1398. The trouble is, we don't know who by, because this was the year in which the real instability of the 15th century begins. Richard II had inherited the throne in 1377. He was the grandson of Edward III, and his reign faced two significant crises. The first in 1384-1385, as he began to assert his personal rule, and the second in 1397. And the trigger for this was the arrest of the Duke of Gloucester, the Earl of Warwick, and Archbishop Thomas Arundel in July 1397. This is thought to have been payback for their attempts to reign Richard II in during 1386. Arundel was banished and was further insulted by being offered the bishopric of St Andrews, which would have been a very poor exchange for Canterbury, even if the Scots would have tolerated it. And just as Richard's regime was stabilizing after that misstep, John of Gaunt dies in early 1399. Now, Gaunt was the key figure. A son of Edward III, he controlled the politics of England from basically around 1370 until his death. And what happened when Gaunt died was that his son, Henry of Bolingbroke, was in exile on the continent, and Richard reneged on the agreements which allowed Bolingbroke to automatically inherit his father's wealth. Well, Bolingbroke was already fairly irritated with Richard, so he decides to roll the dynastic dice and invade England, ably egged on by Archbishop Arundel and the out-of-favour group of courtiers. He lands at Ravenspur in the East Riding of Yorkshire, and all those who are disaffected with the arbitrary nature of Richard II's rule tend to rally to Henry of Bolingbroke's standard, and he eventually corners Richard in North Wales. Richard surrenders and is forced to abdicate on the 30th of September 1399. However, the Holland dispenser faction try to launch a counter-revolution against Henry of Bolingbroke in January 1400, with the result that Richard either is starved to death in Pontefract Castle or starves himself to death in Pontefract Castle in February 1400. Now, the changeover from the Yorkist line, as represented by Richard II, to the Lancastrian line, as represented by Henry IV or Henry Bolingbroke, puts the Beauforts in a very advantageous position. And one of the first fruits of this in 1404 is that Thomas Beaufort, sorry, wrong first name, Henry Beaufort, becomes Bishop of Winchester. Now, Winchester was at that time a diocese which stretched from the Thames through Surrey and Hampshire down to the Channel coast. Winchester had been the Anglo-Saxon capital of England, and Henry Beaufort, of course, was the originally illegitimate son of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, and therefore was closely related to the royal family. Beaufort seems to have been primarily a politician and a diplomat. However, like many of the politicians or diplomats of that era, he was also a churchman. And there's an interesting little battle that goes on through the remaining years of Thomas Arundel's time as Archbishop of Canterbury and the succeeding Archiepiscopate of Henry Chicheley between Beaufort, who, because of his close royal connections, is trying to get some sort of control over the direction of the English Church, and the Archbishops of Canterbury. Now, under Henry V, Henry Beaufort is a little bit out of favour. I think Henry is a little bit intimidated by his uncle, certainly finds that he's a little too much the diplomat, and Henry is the fifth is the variety who prefers direct action, hence Harfleur and Agincourt. But once Henry V is dead, Beaufort takes advantage of the minority of Henry VI to be appointed papal legate and cardinal. And this effectively usurps Archbishop Chichely, who concentrates on the Diocese of Canterbury. Now, this result brings about one of those periodic spats between the medieval papacy and the English Church. Chichely is very keen to defend his rights as Archbishop of Canterbury, which included being regarded as legatus natus, i.e. that is papal legate by virtue of his office, whereas Henry Beaufort was a legate by virtue of direct papal appointment. And the climax of the conflict comes in 1420, when Chichely declares a jubilee at Canterbury for those visiting the shrine of Thomas Becket, which of course irritates Rome because it's likely to distract pilgrimage from Rome to Canterbury, and of course they don't like having their pocket god affected. And as a result of this, that puts Beaufort in a strong position to become papal legate. And so from this point onwards, there's almost always a cardinal and a papal legate in England. What about the Lollards in this period? Well, John of Gaunt always found the Lollards useful. He liked stirring up trouble for the Roman Church, and he found the Lollards a very useful group of assistants in that mission. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, the chief defender of the Lollard cause was removed, and Arundel, who was far more concerned with maintaining orthodoxy than he was with repelling the claims of the Roman Church, basically pressurizes Henry of Bolingbroke into launching a full-scale investigation into the Lollard heresy. It also doesn't help that the Wycliffites attack the two sacred cows of the late medieval papacy, transubstantiation and the authority of the priesthood. They probably would have got away with preaching predestination, justification by faith, but you did not challenge the priesthood or transubstantiation, because the power of the church, it was felt, depended on those two issues. And this is what leads to the eventual condemnation of both John Wycliffe and Jan Hus at the Council of Constance. It isn't what they say about justification, it's what they say about the priesthood, transubstantiation, and the authority of the papacy. Also, we're in a period where we've got one pope too many. We've got the Great Schism going on. The main line is in Avignon, but there is usually an anti-pope in Rome. In 1413, there's a brief attempt at reconciliation, and a council ignores the two existing popes and elects a third, which is the result that we now have two popes too many. And it's only with the Council of Constance that a final settlement is brokered, and in 1417, Martin V is elected, and he is quite definite about papal authority. He's actually quite a wily old coot, in that he manages to use his position as Pope to extend, thanks to a newly reunited papacy, papal claims. Now, he's very careful with England, because the English Church has to operate under two statutes intended to limit foreign jurisdiction in England. The first is the Statute of Provisors, which limits, it doesn't quite eliminate, but it very certainly severely limits the ability of the Pope to appoint men to benefices in England. The second is praemunire, which is a sort of rather vaguely worded statute that is intended to stop the church trespassing on the king's prerogative. And it's never that clearly defined what praemunire actually is, except it's very useful to whip it out of the legal dictionary every time you thought the Pope was poking his nose into English business way too much. And as a result of this, Martin V has to use all his diplomatic skills to ensure that the English church is kept firmly under papal control. And he does this by negotiating with Henry IV, and then with Henry V, then with various regents in the early part of Henry VI's reign, in order that the king's candidate and the Pope's candidate for the major bishoprics, Canterbury, London, Winchester, Durham, York, is usually the same. As a sort of sop to keep the popes happy, the English kings in the late 15th century sort of develop a habit of allowing the Pope to appoint the Bishop of Worcester. I don't know what the kings had against Worcester, but it usually ended up with a papally provided bishop. And this relationship between Rome and the court in London operates fairly smoothly for the whole of the 15th century. The only serious hiccup is the quarrel between Beaufort and Chichele in the 1420s. But it has to be admitted that the church in England is going through a period of subtle change. You're leaving the medieval world, and really we are on the verge of the Renaissance. The Renaissance starts a lot earlier in Italy than it does in England. The English tend to be instinctively conservative, and they are an awfully long way from Italy. And as a result of this, you have the final great flowering of medieval art in the form of the perpendicular style of architecture, which dominates most of the great royal projects of the late 14th and early 15th century. If you look at the Chapel of Eton College, King's College, Cambridge, the rebuilding of Winchester Cathedral, which is actually rather a cunning makeover. What William Waynflete's architects did was they took the skin off the old Norman building and put a new perpendicular skin over the bones of the old Norman building. So we got a new cathedral at half the price. The substantial rebuilding at Canterbury in this period. The choir of York Minster is rebuilt. Gloucester, where the perpendicular style begins, is rebuilt from 1340 onwards. And the great advantage of perpendicular was, because of the perpendiculars across the windows, you could create these huge expanses of glass. And of course, stained glass was an art that particularly appealed to the English. I think it has something to do with it being so cloudy up there. And as a result of this, the perpendicular style dominates in England from roughly 1350 until well into the reign of Elizabeth I. And you can sort of see the last vestiges of the perpendicular style as it dies in the earliest churches in Virginia. There's a certain amount of Gothic survival work in places like St. John's, Hampton. You know, they come right at the very end of that last flowering of the Gothic style. One of the things you might have picked up on from the fact I mentioned Eton and Kings is this is a period where royal patronage moves away from the monasteries to schools and colleges. And really the great flood of monastic patronage has dried up by 1300. And men are looking at different ways of both memorializing themselves and also helping the church. So at the very end of the 13th century, you get the foundation of the first colleges in Oxford and Cambridge. University College Oxford is about 1260. The oldest Cambridge college is about a generation later. A little bit later comes Balliol, and then towards the end of the 14th century, you have a rash of foundations, including Oriel College, which was to cause so much trouble in the 1830s. And then, of course, you have a multiplication of colleges all the way through the 15th century. So King's College, Cambridge, Magdalen College, Oxford, Jesus College, Cambridge are all 15th century foundations. And this represents a shift of aristocratic, episcopal, and royal patronage from the monasteries to schools and universities. The bishops of this era divide abruptly between men of relatively humble background like William of Wykeham, William Waynflete, and great aristocratic churchmen like Henry Cardinal Beaufort, Thomas Arundel, Thomas Bourchier, who were descended from the richest, if not necessarily the oldest and most established aristocratic houses. Canterbury almost seems to go back and forth between aristocrats and diplomats in the 15th century. So you have Thomas Arundel with his aristocratic background. His successor, Henry Chichely, is of comparatively modest background, but had been one of the king's senior lawyers. And that sort of sets the pattern for the 15th century. The monasteries are in relative decline. Most monasteries don't recover in terms of number after the Black Death. Their numbers are approximately halved in 1348 to 1350. They climb modestly in the late 14th century, and then they kind of get stuck. So, for example, Canterbury, which had had 120 monks in the late 13th century, never really gets past 75 for the remainder of its existence, down to the dissolution of the cathedral priory in 1540. The friars increasingly are basically losing their fervour. In Oxford and Cambridge, they are losing the battle against the university. They're outside of the university system, and gradually they're made to submit to the university authorities, or their students will not be recognised by the universities. The colleges actually represent something of a move away from monastic control of the universities. The colleges offered somewhere safe to be other than either the regents' halls, which are sort of the earliest form of student housing in Oxford and Cambridge, and the houses of the mendicant friars. The colleges generally are founded along the lines of small collegiate churches. So you have a master, you have a group of fellows, and then you have a group of students who benefit from the foundation. And this was to be the foundation of the collegiate system right up until the 19th century reforms. The fellowships basically left students who already had an arts degree free from financial worries to pursue higher degrees in theology, law, medicine, or music. Certainly in the 15th century, the church's higher levels are supplied by the universities. So you have a university-educated senior clergy. All of the archbishops of the 15th century, with one exception, are Oxford men. And then below them, you have the parochial clergy. And the parochial clergy is a right mixed bag. The parish clergy of the 15th century, in the main, should not be thought of as a bunch of knuckle-dragging ignoramus. They were modestly well educated. Most of them were fluent in Latin. Most of them were reasonably fluent in written English, because they were, whether they liked it or not, part of the whole great machinery of church administration. So they had to keep records. They had to apply to the bishops for various pieces of paperwork. And as such, they needed to be modestly literate. They were also required to preach 4 times a year, though how many of those gladly handed on that responsibility to friars and other professional preachers, we don't really know. Below the parish church clergy was the vast army of chantry priests, who really represent the bargain basement of the late medieval clergy. Their duties were extremely light. For the most part, they were expected to recite the daily office and sing mass for the founders of the chantry. And they were a perpetual pain in the neck, both to the ordinary parish clergy and to the bishops. And periodically some sort of an attempt is made to bring them under control. For example, in Lincoln, there was an attempt to make them live in a common dormitory, keep a common table, and generally obey the same statutes as the vicar's choral of the minster, in order to reduce their tendency to sit around in alehouses tippling all day. Certainly the local bishop had no great appreciation of chantry priests. And chantries were very much part of everyday life in a medieval parish. My home parish had no less than 3, possibly 5 chantry chapels. There was the chantry of St. Thomas a Becket in the north aisle of St. Mary's Church. There was the chantry of the Holy Trinity in the south aisle of the church. And then across at St. Peter's Church, there's evidence of chantries in both aisles, one of which apparently was dedicated to St. George. The other one is thought to have been St. Ninian, but we're not sure. And these chantries, of course, were provided with priests. And in the case of the Barton chantries, they were sort of the bargain basement version. They didn't have a single founder. They were founded by a guild. And one of the benefits of joining the guild was that when you died, your soul was prayed for by the guild chantry in the parish church. It all made good financial sense, and of course it's well in line with that great tradition of heavenly fire insurance, which one battles with in everyday parish life today. The chantries were, in the main, the domain of the middle and upper classes. The poor took their chances with the ministrations of the parish priest. Often they could vary in scale between a single priest and a relatively modest endowment, which is the variety that existed in my home parish, through to quite elaborate chantry colleges like Tattershall, which had a warden and 6 fellows, or Fotheringhay in Huntingdonshire, which had a warden and 9 canons. But the intent was always the same, to ease the passage of the donor or donors and their families through purgatory and into heaven. The other great beneficiary of late medieval piety was the grammar school. Places like Eton, Winchester College, Waynflete School in Lincolnshire, St Paul's, were all founded by wealthy ecclesiastics or members of the royal family to secure a supply of boys who were sufficiently well educated to go into the new universities, which is why there is a tie-up between certain colleges and certain schools. So, for instance, Winchester College to New College, Oxford, was a common progression. Eton to King's College, Cambridge, is another tie-up because both were founded by Henry VI. William Waynflete founds a grammar school in his own hometown of Waynflete in Lincolnshire. His original surname was Patton, by the way, and that ties in with his foundation of Magdalen College in Oxford. So you have this supply from the grammar schools to the university colleges of educated men who eventually become the top tier in the church's administration. Church life in this period is orderly and settled for the most part, in spite of the rolling conflicts of the 15th century. There's the ongoing conflict over the succession in France. England is basically at war with France, nothing new in that, from the 1330s through to the 1450s. The abundance of returning troops in the 1450s leads to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses, which go on intermittently from 1460 to 1485. And this dynastic squabble, in one sense, was extremely disruptive. An awful lot of English aristocrats died on the battlefield. On the other hand, unless your parish church or your local monastery happened to be in the path of a marauding army, it didn't affect most of the population. So you see in the later part of the 15th century a lot of church building going on. Boston was trying to make Boston's stump less of a stump by raising the tower to its present height of 295 feet. At the same time, on a much more modest scale, the church wardens in my home parish had decided that it was dark in there and they needed a clear story to light the centre of the church, and both of those were constructed in the 1460s and the 1470s at the height of the Wars of the Roses. So the intermittent warfare of the 15th century really doesn't percolate down to the ordinary level. But what is becoming very apparent is that the church is really between two eras. It's between the great scholastics of the 14th century and the advent of the new learning at the end of the 15th, the beginning of the 16th century. And the first signs of the new learning, which come out of the universities at the very end of the 15th century, are people like John Colet, who eventually becomes Dean of St Paul's. He's born in 1467. He goes to Oxford University. He's educated in Paris for a few years, and then he comes back to England and he's picked up and been influenced by the opinions of the Italian humanists. And he's really the first English clergyman of any great influence who goes back to the unvarnished biblical text. And you can see in the work of people like John Colet the beginnings of the sort of engagement with the biblical text which would eventually lead to the English Reformation. But it's very slow in coming. One of the famous quotes from Erasmus is about the University of Cambridge, which he describes as having bad beer and worse scholarship when he visited there in 1513. The fact of the matter was England was still a relatively conservative country, And as a result of this, the old methods from the early 14th century were still being followed. I've mentioned the decline of the monasteries in the 15th century, but it wasn't complete doom and gloom. Two orders did extremely well in this period. The first is the Brigittines. Now, the Brigittines are one of those orders which, quite frankly, unless you're a Northern European, you've probably never heard of. They were founded by St. Bridget of Sweden in the middle of the 14th century, and they're one of the earliest reformed monastic orders. They're somewhat similar in outlook to the later observants, and they were double houses. They were staffed on the one hand by a small group of canons whose function was to provide for the sacramental needs of the community of nuns and also to preach. On the other side of a dirty great brick wall was a community of nuns who engaged in scholarship. Now, this is something a little bit new in the Middle Ages. A deliberate intention to promote scholarship amongst women. And this particular order is very popular in Sweden and Scandinavia. It has some very important patronage in England because it attracts the interest of Henry V. And he founds Sion Abbey, close to the great royal estate of Sheen, which would later become Richmond Palace. And Zion is, like all of the great Lancastrian royal foundations, rather a plush job. The monastic church was 300 feet by 120. You know, this is a very large church. It's a hall church, which is an unusual design in England, but is very common in Germany and to a lesser extent in Scandinavia. On one side of the church is the nuns' cloister, on the other side of the church is the canons' cloister, and by the looks of what little bit of manuscript evidence we have a split-level church. The nuns' choir is on the ground floor, the canons' choir is on the first floor, so the two never actually run into each other, but they can hear each other's chanting. Zion was liberally endowed, and it became a favourite monastic retreat for members of the royal family. Henry V is the last great monastery founder amongst English kings. His son, the very pious Henry VI, preferred to found schools and colleges for the education of the clergy. Hence, in his case, Eton and King's College, Cambridge. And they share with the monastery of Zion Abbey. They share with Zion Abbey the large-scale, elaborate architecture that is characteristic of the royal project in this period. Well, that was interesting. And these royal projects are the real foundation of the late Perpendicular style. King's College, by the way, is not completed by Henry VI. It's still dragging on under Henry VIII. It takes over 100 years to get it to the state it's in now, and it was never finished. I mean, these big royal projects dragged on for years, and they represent a continuing investment in the church by the monarchy as a sign of its stability and its legitimacy. At the end of the 15th century, it used to be the fashion to think the Church of England was ripe for reform. I think that view today has to be modified. The English church was probably less corrupt than the church in France or the Holy Roman Empire, or especially Italy. The influence of the Roman Curia was relatively limited. The two universities of Oxford and Cambridge supplied a sufficient number of educated clergy. The parish clergy were not particularly weak in terms of their educational standard. For the most part, the monasteries had their weak points, but episcopal visitation was generally sufficiently rigorous to keep them up to a certain basic standard. But what was lacking, as it was lacking everywhere else in Europe at that time, is any sort of engagement with the biblical text, with patristics, and this is what's going to change quite rapidly after 1485, which is a convenient cut-off date in English history because of the change of dynasty. You get the first signs of the humanist revival in learning in the 1450s, but it doesn't really take off until the 1490s, when you get people like John Colet, to a lesser extent rather old-fashioned figures like Richard Fox, have this interest in learning, which means that they promote humanism in the universities. And it's really, there really is truth to the old saw about Erasmus laying the egg which Luther hatched. If you take Erasmus as being representative of the sort of Christian humanism that was becoming very prevalent at the end of the 15th century. The difficulty with a lot of this is that the humanist movement of the late 15th century coincides precisely with the papacy at its worst. Alexander VI Borgia reigns from 1491 to 1502. He's followed by Julius II, 1502 to 1513, who is better known for his wars against the French than any of his spiritual projects. His main spiritual project was securing the revenue to rebuild St. Peter's in Rome. I'm not quite sure you call that a spiritual project, but it helped the Reformation on. Because, of course, like all good late medieval popes, he issued an indulgence or two to keep the money rolling in. Similarly, the Roman court was unusually corrupt. To get anything done, you had to grease palms liberally. So, for example, in 1504 through 1509, when Henry VII is trying to get a papal dispensation for his surviving son Henry to marry Arthur's widow Catherine of Aragon, he's shipping off cartloads of silver to Rome to grease palms to make sure he gets the papal the papal documentation that he needs. In the same way, another part of this give and take between the papacy and the monarchy is that the Pope is allowed to make certain appointments in England as a sort of sweetener on the deal for Henry to get his dispensation. And this was the common way of doing business at the time. So, when you get later into Henry VIII's reign and he's shipping off the silver to Rome for his annulment and not getting a result, he's, seriously surprised. And we'll investigate that a little bit more next week. But the church that you have at the end of the 15th century is really looking for a revival of learning, is already having sort of a revival of spirituality through the English mystics like Walter Hilton, In the Low Countries, you have the Brethren of the Common Life. Even the Bridgertines have a new focus in terms of spirituality. Their particular object was to promote devotion to the Passion of Christ, which is kind of a drift away from the more sort of saint-orientated spirituality of the High Middle Ages. The Brethren of the Common Life try and pursue a simple Christian, prayerful lifestyle in common, whilst founding no permanent monasteries. In fact, they didn't even have vows. People came and went in and out of the Brethren of the Common Life, and it was quite a common experience for someone to spend some years living with the Brethren and then move on into a different stage of their career. Thomas à Kempis was one of those. He's very much associated with the Brethren of the Common Life in his middle years, and in his later years, he seems to have become just a canon regular in one of the many small religious houses in the Netherlands. The long and the short of the matter is you have a church at the end of the 15th century, which really is part of the fabric of society, part of the fabric of government. Successive Lord Chancellors are bishops, successive Lord Privy Seals are bishops. They're involved with the high offices of state. They didn't see much of their dioceses. They were usually looked after by poor Irish bishops who had nothing better to do. And there's a sort of lack of real zeal in this period, outside of a few particularly blessed corners, such as the observant friars who come into England in 1498, a few reformed houses of the Carthusians, the Cistercians, and the Dominicans. The rest are just comfortable with business as usual. So when humanism finally hits England about 1500, it begins to bring into being the taste for better scholarship and for reform in the church. So Henry VIII, both before and after the break with Rome, encouraged reformers, and it's those reformers that we're going to look at next week. And I even managed to keep it to 45 minutes. Whoa. Now it's time for the good old question time.
Well, hey, two follow-ups for me. One, I asked a question last week because I'm very interested in this, and it's going to be some of my new reading list. The mystics and writers of, from the 1300s, the little there before, we asked you a question. You said you were going to hit on that this week.
Yeah.
And which I think tonight was phenomenal. I mean, this was the best explanation I've heard so far. I mean, timeline, movement, phenomenal. So I don't really see where my original question really even fit in. But the other question too is your blog this week, or your thing on Facebook, and we were talking about this apostolic succession. If you'd like on a second part, clear that up from your original part in the very beginning of this lecture series about a question about apostolic succession.
And the question is?
Well, you were saying that we didn't know the direct trace.
No, I mean, we'll get back to...
that was, and you cleared that up in your Facebook posting this week as well. I just thought maybe a good way to clear it up on the video.
Basically, if you go back from Thomas Cranmer, the furthest you can get is Henry Beaufort. And the reason for this is that Archbishop Walden was appointed but not consecrated. Walden's register doesn't survive, so we don't know who was given the job of consecrating Cardinal Beaufort, or Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Lincoln, as he was at that time. And as a result of this, we don't know who from that point back. We can guess that it was probably the Bishop of London was the principal consecrator of Henry Beaufort, but we don't know. And the Romans have the same problem in the 1520s. You get back to Cardinal Rebeba, and that's it. The record of his consecration is lost. But we know perfectly well that it was the established practice of the Church for bishops to be consecrated by 3 other bishops, and this goes all the way back to the Council of Nicaea. So we know that the apostolic succession is there. We just don't exactly know the who's and wheres back beyond 1398. So, that's what you're looking at in terms of, apostolic succession. One of the things that always makes me wince a little bit is when you get, and I'm afraid it's the old Catholics who do it the most, so I am going to pick on them. Some guy applies to be licensed as a priest in the UEC, and the first thing I get is not his academic qualifications, but 12 sheets, almost outlining his apostolic succession back to Abraham. But that's not the idea. The idea is that, this person has been set apart by the Church to be a minister of word and sacrament. And the Church has delegated that authority to them in the manner in which the Church has always done that, which is the laying on of hands with prayer by a bishop, or bishops who have, gone through the same thing themselves. So, the continuity is not about hands on heads. It's about the continuity of teaching in the Church and the continuity of ministerial authority. It's very easy to get off into the land of, magic and mumbo jumbo with apostolic succession. But, it's there nonetheless.
Your Grace?
Yes.
Isn't there a misconception on the part of many that apostolic succession is a step-by-step linear succession instead of being more of a, to use an analogy, a spiderweb type of succession?
Oh, yeah. You get all sorts of interesting things going on with apostolic succession. I mean, if you just look at Anglican orders today, you've got old Catholic orders there. The one branch of the direct line goes back to Rome. Another branch is Scandinavian. It's a whole spider's web. And it has to be seen in the context of that most, basic of principles behind the sacraments, which is, doing what the Church has always been doing. So, for example, from UECNA orders, you can get back to Utrecht 2 different ways. You can either go back to Utrecht via the Philippine Independent Catholics, to the Polish National Catholics, to Archbishop Gull in the early 1900s, or you can go straight back through the Polish National Catholics, who participated in Horace Donegan's consecration, who was one of the co-consecrators of Bishop Chambers, straight back to the Netherlands that way. And then you've also got Canterbury involved through, the Philippine Independent Church, because one of the co-consecrators there was an English consecrated bishop who was in Japan. So, it's quite literally a spider's web. Great fun for those who have already exhausted their own genealogy. Okay, any more fun stuff?
Yeah, hey, how about the mystics and those writers and on that? Is there something really good? Because that seemed like to me, like reading this, like that was a very interesting, maybe I'm wrong on reading this and I got to read their stuff, and I just done some quick Googling, that this could have really been the way they were talking. It almost seems like it's like the beginning of the Reformation, like the beginning of like, this is some early writing movement.
What it is a shift in piety. And it's really a product in many respects of the shock of the Black Death. So there's a move away from traditional liturgical piety towards mysticism. There's almost a sense that in the 15th century, the monasteries lose out because the sort of people who would have been drawn into the monasteries in the 13th century go one of two ways. They either go into the universities, or those who want an austere, prayerful life become hermits and mystics. So you get people like Dame Julian of Norwich, who quite consciously embrace this eremitic life. And they write about their own mystical experience. And this is certainly something that you see through the 14th century into the 15th century. You have other mystics such as Meister Eckhart, with his concepts of divine love. And that, for instance, he taught that the Holy Trinity was a community of divine love which overflowed into creation. And this sort of more personal, more intense piety is very appealing in a world where you have random events like civil war, Black Death, the general sort of uncertainty of life in the colder 15th century. This more sort of intensely personal sort of piety has its appeal, especially to the burgess class. You know, the urban, I wouldn't exactly call them rich, but they have enough wealth to have leisure time to devote to religion. And this is precisely the circle in which groups like the Brethren of the Common Life find their greatest following. They're people who are intensely concerned with the state of their own soul, but they're maybe not particularly interested in traditional piety like chantries, like monasteries. They want something for themselves, you know, a more direct approach to God. But you can't really see it, though, as being theologically a run-up to the Reformation. But it's definitely a forerunner of religion becoming personal rather than external. I mean, it was never wholly external. But, you know, the high medieval concept is a man obtained salvation through participating in the sacraments of the church. It's a very, you know, A plus B equals C kind of relationship with God. And people wanted something deeper, more mystical, so you get this explosion of mysticism in the more unstable and uncertain late medieval world. I think it's, you know, it's a cultural phenomenon as much as a theological one. Of course, you are talking to somebody for whom mysticism is a closed book.
No, I got that. I mean, you know, I was just trying to, it seems like there was a underlining. I didn't know how powerful the movement was, you know, with my side being a little more evangelical and looking at a movement, like what caused the movement, looking from that. That was my only thought was, hey, well, wow, here's all these writings, here's all these guys, and they're kind of taking that first step into that personal.
One interesting tidbit from the late Middle Ages is that there was a popular devotion to the 5 wounds of Christ, which becomes very popular about 1450. And those who were deeply, you know, into this. You know, they said, you know, 5 Our Fathers, 5 Hail Marys, and the prescribed prayers each morning on rising as a remembrance of the 5 wounds of Christ. And it was intended to foster devotion to Christ as the Savior of the world. You find in amongst all the bravura settings of the Salve Regina, Gaudi Gloriosa Dei Mater, you know, the great Marian antiphon texts that were popular in the late medieval church, you find O Bona Jesu, O good Jesus. So, you know, there's a growing devotion to the human side of Christ in the late Middle Ages, almost, I think, as a counterbalance, first of all, to, you know, Christ our God, you know, the judge and disposer of men's fates. And also, I think there's an awareness, certainly in more educated circles, that the devotion to the saints had perhaps gone a little bit over the top. You know, it's very interesting that in the statutes of the Brigittine order, the saints are very much second place to the idea that the order is founded to promote devotion to the passion of Christ. So there is a shift there to a more Christocentric spirituality, and I think that does feed into the Reformation.
All right. Hey, some more questions here. We got a great session going on tonight. Any more questions?
I have a quick question for you, Bishop, about the curriculum of the grammar schools. And I was just wondering, to what degree was there any oversight, either ecclesiastically or from Rome, or is it really up to the schoolmaster to decide what you're going to assign in your classroom in the medieval grammar schools?
Schoolmasters were licensed by the bishop for the most part, and that was to remain a feature of English church life up until probably Elizabeth I's time. Most of them taught Latin and a good deal of stick. You know, the basic idea was to prepare you for university, and unless you were fluent in Latin, university was not a lot of use to you. The basics of mathematics, the basics of music, the basics of rhetoric would be addressed in grammar school, but basically it was Latin and flogging. And when you got to university, the floggings decreased, but the Latin didn't. The other thing I think basically that controlled the grammar school curriculum in this period was, you know, most of the schoolmasters had been to university. So they knew what you needed to know in order to get in. So mathematics, a little bit of logic, a little bit of rhetoric, a lot of Latin.
All right, another question. All right, well, it's exactly 7:30, and just remind everybody to send me in an email, and I can get you on as attending the class tonight. And so we will have this out to you to be reposted here in a couple nights. Archbishop, any closing words and a last prayer for us, my friend?
Just a quick reminder, next week we are looking basically at the beginnings of the English Reformation. So now this is the point at which Moorman starts getting a little nervous. So have fun. Let us pray. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favourably on thy whole church, that the wonderful and sacred mystery, and by the tranquil operation of thy perpetual providence, carry out the work of man's salvation, and let the whole world feel and see that things which were cast down are being raised up, that those which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to perfection through him from whom they took their origin, even Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good night, all.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Nice seeing you all.